This is Inner Healing Paths podcast. Here we discuss the healing of the mind, body, soul, and spirit through a variety of different paths. We have emotional and spiritually minded conversations centering on ancestral healing, psychology, astrology, yoga, meditation, magic, and indigenous spiritual practices of the world. I am your host, Rosa Shetty, and I am so happy you are here. Welcome. Welcome back to another episode of Inner Healing Paths podcast. I'm your host, Rosa, and thank you for joining us. So this episode is with Mark Wolynn. He is a best-selling author. He wrote a book titled It Didn't Start With You: How Inherited Family Trauma Shapes Who We Are and How to End the Cycle. So in this interview, we talk about what is inherited family trauma or generational transmission of trauma. He shared about some of the research behind the inherited trauma. He talked about how it can manifest as physical illnesses, not just emotional manifestations. We talked about the trauma language, and he also generously shared some tips and advice on how you can start your own healing journey. And in the interview, you're going to hear me share a little bit about my story and how I became aware of my own inherited trauma. And I just had such a wonderful time talking to him. I learned so much, and I know you will too. So without further ado, take a listen. Hi, Mark.
Hi, Rosa. How you doing?
Hi. Doing very well. So nice to meet you.
Well, nice to meet you too.
Yes, thank you so much for agreeing to be on my show.
Yeah, no, I'm happy to do it.
Wonderful.
Yeah,
I've been I've read your books and I've been a fan of your work for a long time. So this is such a treat for me.
Oh, Rosa, that's nice.
Yeah.
That's
So are you
nice.
ready?
I'm ready. Tell me,
Okay.
yeah, what
Yeah,
sort of
let's get started. So for our
okay.
listeners, those that are not familiar with your work, can you tell us a little bit more about yourself and the healing work that you do?
Yeah, I'm happy to do that. I see myself as the guy with the flashlight. I'm shining it on
Yeah.
the symptoms and the behaviors that we can't explain. So I help people, both clinicians and non-clinicians, recognize the importance of generational trauma and its biological effects on subsequent generations. So I've developed a way of looking at trauma language, helping us become detectives of this trauma language so that we can uncover it and discover that it's leading us back to either an event in our family history or an event in our early childhood or infancy, or even the pregnancy. Basically, we're all walking around with a mystery that we can't explain. We're all living with this mystery. We have unexplained fears or anxiety that strikes suddenly when we reach a certain age or get into a certain situation. Or we have a depression that we can never get to the bottom of. We have these symptoms, but they may not be ours. Just like the book says, it didn't start with you. These symptoms could be the residue of traumas that stem from our family history, and we've biologically inherited this from our parents and grandparents.
Yeah, no, absolutely. For me, it was such an eye-opener when I finally realized and made those connections. I was aware of my own lived experiences and the traumas that I've experienced. But when I became aware that some of the things that I was struggling with actually go way back, and to be able to map it out was just, for me, just a life changer. It just changed my whole perception of myself, and even some personality traits. Sometimes you don't even realize how the extent of how these traumas or these huge events that our ancestors, our grandparents, parents experience, and how they still play out. The energy of these still very much play out, and the awareness of it is huge.
Yeah, it's interesting. So I have people look at the events of their parents, the events of their grandparents, the events of their aunts and uncles, but also the events that took place in utero, and that took place in our early life. So even though I'm the generational guy, I'm the inherited trauma guy, I find that half of the work sits in attachment issues, our early relationship with our mom.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And just how did you get started in this field? How did how did because this, I mean, for me, it's such a fascinating field, but it for me was through books and but I'm just curious for you, how did you get into this inherited trauma?
Quite accidentally, I assure you. Like many of us, I had symptoms I couldn't explain. About 30 years ago, I began to lose the vision in one of my eyes, and I was diagnosed with a chronic form of retinopathy. And then the doctors couldn't cure it, and they said, "Look,
Yeah.
we think it's stress." But the way it was progressing, they told me I was likely going to lose the vision in my other eye as well,
Mm,
and I was pretty freaked out. I was
yeah.
um, desperate to find help. So I went on a search for healing,
Mm-hmm.
and this search led me halfway around the globe,
Mm,
literally as far as Indonesia, where I learned from several wise teachers who taught me some fundamental principles of life, one of which was the
yeah.
importance of healing our relationship with our parents.
Mm,
Um, and my relationship with my parents was completely broken, and before I could really heal, I had to heal what stood in the way,
mm,
which was inherited family trauma. I didn't know it at the time, but specifically the anxiety that I had inherited throughout the family, from my grandparents. Really, each of my grandparents were all orphaned in some way.
mm,
Three of them lost their mothers when they were babies, and the fourth lost her father when she was one. So ultimately, she loses um, her mother in the grief. But
yeah.
this anxiety, this was the real cause of my vision loss. And just like my parents before me, I had inherited this feeling of being broken from my mother's love, just like they had, being the children of orphans. And this is what had passed down into my family. I remember, oh gosh, being a small boy, maybe 5 or 6, feeling panicked whenever my mom would leave the house, and I'd run into her room, and I'd start pulling open her drawers and
Oh, yeah.
crying
Mm-hmm.
into her scarves and her nightgowns, thinking that
Yeah.
I'd never see her again, and that her smell would be the only thing I had left. Now, this would have been true for my grandparents. They would only have had a garment, a shirt or a sweater or a house coat or something that their mothers had left behind. So, this was my pattern. My mom leaves and I'm breathing in her scent. And 40 years later, I shared this with my mom. I said, Mom, when you were gone when I was little, I'd run into her room and cry into her clothes. She said, Oh, honey, I did the same thing. And my sister reading the book said, You did that
Wow.
too? I did that
Yeah.
too. And that was the family pattern. So
So
after healing,
amazing. Yeah.
just one more sentence, really. Just so after healing the broken bond with my mom, which is why I keep looking at
Mm-hmm.
attachment as well, my
Mm-hmm.
sight came back, my vision came back. And afterwards, I felt
Mm.
compelled to share the principles I learned, and ultimately developed a method for healing the effects of inherited family trauma.
Yeah, so I mean, so amazing and so fascinating, right? How that just kind of all plays into and it manifests in these very physical symptoms that are very real. We experience them and just the awareness that you gain of having this understanding of inherited family trauma, how it can help you even heal physically, some of or at least have an understanding of where these physical symptoms are coming from, which is so powerful.
Yeah.
Uh, and when it comes to inherited trauma, how it just in very general terms for the folks that are listening and may not be familiar with this at all, how would you describe this or define this?
Yeah, that's a really good question. What is it, and how am I affected by it? So let's say that one of our parents or our grandparents lost their mom or their dad when they were young, or our mother or father, maybe they were sent away to be raised by relatives or placed in an orphanage or a residential school, boarding school, or maybe one of their siblings died tragically when they were little. An event like this can devastate the family, and the reaction to the trauma doesn't necessarily stop with the people who experienced it. So the feelings and the sensations, specifically the stress response, the way the genes express, this can pass forward to the children and the grandchildren, affecting them in a similar way, even though they didn't personally experience the trauma.
Okay, that's such a, and I think a lot of folks don't have that awareness, right? That of how it can really be passed on from one generation to the next. And I know there's tons of research now, thankfully, about this. And I think that this research has really brought some of that awareness, and are you familiar with any of the research or
Oh yeah,
anything out there?
as you know
Yeah,
from
can
as
you
you know from
share?
the
Yeah.
as you know from the book, I mean, the biggest
Yes.
chapter, the chunkiest chapter in the book is
Yes.
all about the research. Here, I'll start at the beginning, really. I mean, just what happens when there's a trauma. When a trauma happens, it changes us. I mean, literally, it causes a chemical change in our DNA. And this changes how our genes function, sometimes for generations. So technically, there's this terrible event, this traumatic event. Somebody dies, somebody leaves. We're small, and a chemical tag attaches to our DNA, and it tells the cell to use or ignore certain genes, enabling us to better deal with this thing that just happened, this trauma. And then the way our genes are affected changes how we act or we feel. For example, we can become sensitive or reactive to situations that are similar to the original trauma, even if that trauma occurred in a previous generation, so that we have a better chance of surviving it in this generation. I'll give you an example. If our grandparents came from a war-torn country, people are being shot, bombs are going off, uniformed men are lining people up in the square, people are being taken away. We never see our parents again. Something, our grandparents would develop and pass forward a skill set from this trauma. Let's say sharper reflexes would be one part of the skill set, or quicker reaction times, or reactions to the violence to help them survive this trauma that they experience. Now they're going to pass this forward, but the problem is we could inherit a stress response, their stress response, with the dials set to 10. And here we are prepared for this trauma, this catastrophe that never arrives. And we live not in a war-torn city, we live in the suburbs. And we rarely make the link that our anxiety, our hypervigilance, our depression is connected to our parents and our grandparents. We just think we're wired this way, Rosa. We never think to connect it. Simply put, memories of trauma are imprinted in our parents and grandparents' sperm cells and egg cells. And this information passes forward to us. And then as a result, we're born with altered brains that are preparing us biologically to cope with traumas that are similar to the ones they experienced.
And the interesting part about that is that even though I think collectively we all have an awareness that these events, these large scale events, of course, are traumatizing, but sometimes we lose the connect or the link. We're not aware of that individual link, right? That this war that happened maybe 3 generations ago, or how it trickles down. So
Absolutely.
I
Absolutely.
yeah.
That's the problem. We're not thinking about the past. We're living in the present, going about our lives, and all of a sudden we hit a certain age, or we enter a certain relationship, or we move to a new city, and then all of a sudden, people always ask me this question. I think I'll just answer this question. People say, what are the signs of inherited trauma? How do I know?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Good. I knew you were probably going to ask me that.
Yeah, no, definitely. Because I think that's what people want to know, right?
Yeah.
Is like, how do I know for me? Yeah, go ahead. Please share with
Yeah,
us.
no. It's such an important question. People are always saying, well, how do I know if I'm affected? And, sure, we can be born with an anxiety or a depression and never separate it from the events of the previous generation. That's true. But we can also experience a fear or a symptom or an illness that strikes suddenly or unexpectedly as soon as we reach a certain age and or hit a certain milestone or event in our lives. For example, age 30 is when our grandmother loses our grandfather and she never marries again, never dates again. She's a widow the rest of her life. And then our parents, without realizing the connection, they get divorced or separated around 30. And then here we are 3 generations later, around the same age. We look at our partner and we say, yeah, she or he doesn't do it for me anymore, without
Yeah.
realizing the connection. Now, so the age is
Yeah.
one thing, but also certain events or milestones that we hit into. For example, as soon as we get married, this can be one of those triggering events. In the book, you remember me talking about this woman who felt trapped in her marriage. She loved this guy. She couldn't wait to marry him. She's thinking this is the greatest guy in the world, and he is. But now that she's married, she's feeling trapped. And so we looked in her family history and we saw that both grandmothers were given away as child brides at age 9 and age 12 to much older men. This happened back in Lebanon. And the traumas expressed differently in each of the sisters. So one sister married a much older man, like the grandmothers, a guy 40 years older. The other sister, one felt trapped. And then the third sister, man, she refused to get in relationships at all because she didn't want to be trapped. So getting married could be a triggering event. Another trigger could be moving to a new place. And then suddenly, Rosa, we become depressed, like our ancestors who were persecuted or who were forced out of, their homeland. Another event could be being rejected by our partner. And then all of a sudden we dip into this terrible grief, and the grief is insurmountable. And we don't realize it, but it's taking us back to an earlier grief, perhaps even one in our own life, maybe when we had a break in the attachment with our mom. Another one is we go to have a child, and all of a sudden there's this ancestral alarm clock that starts ringing. I once worked with this woman. She was consumed with anxiety and she had no idea why. And so we're working together. And I said, so when did this anxiety begin? And she said, well, when I got pregnant 7 months ago. And I said, oh, that makes sense. So tell me about other people who got pregnant in your family. Because she was telling me she had this terrible fear of harming her baby. And where did that come from, right? She has this terrible fear of harming her baby. And all of a sudden I said, did you ever harm a baby? And she said, no. And I said, did anyone in your family ever harm a baby? And she said, oh, wait a minute. And she says, oh my God, my grandmother, when she was a young woman, she lit a candle and accidentally caught the curtains on fire, and that caught the house on fire. And the baby was upstairs sleeping, and she tried to run up the steps, but there were flames and she couldn't, and her baby died. And then the woman said, but we were never allowed to talk about it.
Yeah.
And that's interesting because I found that the more we don't talk about things, the more that can feed the
Absolutely.
complex. And
It's
in
like
that
this
moment, go
the
ahead.
energy of a secret, right? Like keeping a secret. It's just so toxic. Yeah.
Exactly. So right there in that moment, she realized she made the link, right? She made the
Mm-hmm.
link that she had inherited that terror from her grandmother. And then after that, we could work together and break the pattern.
That's so amazing. And that story that you just shared, I can relate to it because that that happened to me when I was pregnant. I had this irrational fear it was anxiety. It was manifested as severe anxiety, but never in my life had I experienced to that extent, the anxiety to that extent, fear, almost like fear of my life, fear that something was going to happen to me, to the baby. Like, it was just this irrational fear that I just said, okay, it's anxiety, pregnancy, hormones, whatever, triggers anxiety. And, that's what it was. But I had already read your book and I had already done my, some work in this regard. And it didn't hit me while I was pregnant, though. It just kind of, after my pregnancy, as I was, recovering postpartum, I started, it was during COVID times. So I was just, with my baby and just kind of like had some downtime to reflect. I was journaling. And it hit me to ask my mom, how her pregnancy was. Like, I just realized, I should find out, like, this is really odd for me. And I know they say the hormones, but it was like extreme, for me. And given my personality, everything, it was just so extreme. And so my mom shared a story with me of something that happened to her when she was pregnant. Then she shared a story with me about my grandma, who, rest in peace, she's no longer here, and how my grandma was in an abusive relationship, physically abusive relationship. And my mom shared that every pregnancy, like she would, she was abused always, pregnant or not pregnant, it didn't matter, And then she shared a story of her great grandmother, what she knew, the same thing had happened. So it was this theme of our life, basically my life is in danger, the life of me and the baby being in danger.
Absolutely.
And it was, for me, it was such a huge like moment of realization, like this, just the legacy of these traumas, how they continue to play out. And I'm kind of tearing up right now just talking about it with you, because for me, it was such a difficult time, even though everything was going well, the pregnancy was well, everything, I'm in a very loving, safe relationship, and yet there was this fear, like something terrible could happen, not
absolutely. Being
and
pregnant means my life could be in danger.
Yes. And it wasn't like a
Baby's
fear,
life.
like physical, like I could be sick. It was a sense of a threat in my environment. Like I remember very
Right.
clearly feeling like, you know what, maybe I shouldn't drive. Like I was thinking, maybe I shouldn't drive because driving is not safe. It's almost like I started um just kind of pointing, just trying to figure out things outside of me that could potentially be harmful. And it wasn't until after that I realized, oh, this was not me. This did, like the title of your book, right? This did not start with me. Like this is something that goes way back. And I'm talking about once I realized this after my pregnancy, and I've actually, like, I talked to my mom extensively about it. I even had a sense of like wanting to know about my ancestors and what my grandmothers specifically and what they experienced. And I learned that this was a theme, in, generation, to generation, like
Yeah, Rosa, that
being
good
with
work.
men. Yeah,
Yeah.
being with men that were toxic and abusive, while, in pregnancy, of course, just kind of amplified that sense of fear, I'm sure, for them, because now they had to protect another life and they couldn't, right? So yes, I want to share that because this resonates so much with me because I experienced this.
Good work. Good work. Yeah. I mean, some women in history, of course, have been punched and lost the babies or left when they were pregnant, or, their husband was cheating, or a baby died, or the mother died in childbirth. Um, so there's so many fears that can pop up around pregnancy. It is one of those triggering
Yeah.
events. So these are the signs. So we have to look for, what did I do? What event did I just experience? When did the feelings come about? Who at a similar age in the family had something happen? Who else in a similar event had something happen? So
Yeah.
good work. That's what I,
Thank you.
in the book,
Yeah.
people, be a detective. I'm
Yes.
teaching people how to be detectives of their family
Yeah.
history, to be detectives of their trauma language.
Absolutely. I mean, that's the only way to get to really understand what has happened, right? Is to, if you are lucky enough to have, your parents and grandparents, and you have that. And but you know what is interesting? A lot of times our parents, grandparents, etc., they sometimes don't want to share because of the
Yeah.
trauma, right? It's so, and some people actually don't know their answer. They, maybe they were adopted, or just didn't just don't have
Wow.
those around them to ask questions, to find out. What would you say to those, that
Ah,
don't have those connections of their blood? I would say blood, ancestors, or
yeah. Well,
generations.
you know the answer because you read my book, because this information lives in our trauma
Yes.
language. It
Mm,
lives in our fears. It lives in our unexplained symptoms. It lives in the destructive or even our self-sabotaging behaviors. It lives in the symptoms of an illness that appear after a certain age. It's in our relationship struggles, in the repeated ways that we deal with money, success, failure. All of this gives a glimpse, um, more than a glimpse. It actually forms a breadcrumb trail that we can follow back, even if we don't know the family history, even if we don't know what happened, even if the story's been lost or kept secret, or we're adopted, or our parents are gone. We have this breadcrumb trail. So I'm putting the cart before the horse. What is trauma language, right? So, how do
yeah.
people? Yeah, yeah. Let me.
Yeah, I mean, please, if you can explain, because I know that's part of the, I mean,
Yeah,
as
that's
it's in
part.
your book, but for those that have not read your book or are not familiar with that core trauma language,
Yeah,
what
I'm
is your
telling
perspective on
people.
that?
I'm telling people that it's in the trauma language, and they're probably wondering what is
Right.
trauma. Okay, look. So
Yeah.
I've discovered. So when a trauma happens, not only are there changes, molecular changes in our DNA. I mean, that's true. But when a trauma happens, also clues are left behind in our emotionally charged words and sentences. For you, clues were left in pregnancy. As soon as you got pregnant, there was this breadcrumb
Yes.
trail
Hmm.
starting to emerge. But when we're looking at the verbal and nonverbal trauma language, which I'll talk about, so let's talk about the verbal language first. So I found that just in our emotionally charged words and sentences, there's already a breadcrumb trail. That when we learn to follow it, we can find the missing piece of the puzzle, which allows that whole picture to come into view, which is what you discovered by asking your mom, and finally gives us a context to why we feel the way we feel. Now, why trauma language? So, as we know from trauma theory, when a traumatic event happens, significant information bypasses our frontal lobes. So, the experience of the trauma, the experience of exactly what happened, can't be named or ordered through words because it bypasses the frontal lobes where we can make sense of it.
Hmm.
In other words, also our language centers get compromised. So without language, our experiences get stored as fragments of memory, fragments of body sensations, fragments of images, fragments of language, fragments of emotions. It's like the mind disperses and essential elements get separated. So another way to say it is we lose the story, and never complete the healing because we don't really have the story. It's sort of splattered, scattered. So what I've discovered is the pieces aren't lost. They've just been rerouted, and then they resurface later into verbal and nonverbal trauma language. So when it's verbal, we look for the physical words like "I'll harm my baby," like that woman said. When it's
Yeah.
verbal, or I'll die, I'll be forgotten, or there'll
Mm.
be nobody there, I'll be all alone, I'll be rejected, I'll be abandoned. This is verbal trauma language.
Okay.
And then we ask, who was abandoned? Who was rejected? Who was betrayed? Who was humiliated? So we can follow that trail. But when it's nonverbal, like yours, we have to look for the physical or emotional symptoms that show up after an unsettling event. For you, getting pregnant made you scared, made you concerned about your safety and the safety of your baby, which is brilliant. You were following the nonverbal trauma language.
Yeah.
Um,
Hmm.
so, what I tell readers is you have to look for the fears and the anxieties that strike suddenly when we reach a particular age, or often it's the same age that something traumatic happened in the family history, or we look for the depression or the destructive behaviors that arise after a situation that's similar to some trauma in our family history. I'll give you an example. Not so long ago, I worked with a woman who developed cancer after her dog died. And so I said, well, tell me about your dog.
Mm-hmm.
And she said, oh, I was with him for 16 years. He was everything to me. So I'm writing down what she's telling me. I was with him for 16 years. He was everything to me. And then I said, all right, tell me about your family history. Well, listen to this. Her mother's favorite brother was killed in a car crash when the mother was 16.
Oh my
And
goodness.
this was everything to her, right? Everything to her. And her father was also, my client's father was also 16 when his father died suddenly of a massive stroke, and he adored his father. So the client, being an only child, is carrying the unresolved grief and pain epigenetically. Remember, traumas are imprinted in the mother's egg cells, the father's sperm cells. They come together, form the embryo, the fetus, and so here we are carrying our parents' traumas again, but having health issues after 16 years when the dog dies. That's part of her nonverbal trauma language. And
so fascinating.
The verbal language is, I was with him for 16 years. He was everything to me. You see how we can start to,
Yeah, absolutely. And those connections are just, I feel like for folks, sometimes it's very hard. I mean, just, day to day, if you haven't really done a lot of reading or done a lot of research or had therapy into this, it's very hard to pick up on these cues, which is, or these, well, I mean, you mentioned your patient had cancer. That's not a subtle cue by any means, but, it sometimes it's hard to make that connection.
Well, but this is what I do in the book. All of us, as I began saying today, all of us are struggling with a mystery. Can't explain it. And we're all walking around. Why do I have these obsessive thoughts? Why do I have this anxiety in a crowded room? Why do I sink into depression every time my partner leaves the house? We can't figure these things out. We must inquire. We must be detectives. We must do self-inquiry. And that's why I wrote the book, to turn people into detectives and to figure out why they say the things they say and why they experience the things they feel. So, I'm a big proponent of inquire, do your self work, look at your behaviors, look at your language. And that's why I wrote this book.
Yeah, no, and one of the I know you provide a lot of exercises that I did in
Oh,
your
good.
book,
I'm
and
glad you did that.
yeah, no, I did, and I was surprised I got a lot of insight, and I think that one of the things that you emphasize a lot in your book is that writing reflection process, like journaling almost, but being able, but from a perspective, very intentional perspective of, so, and it's interesting how sometimes when we just set that time aside to really reflect on these questions, sometimes the answers seem to just come out of our hand as we're writing. It's so fascinating. And I deeply believe, I'm a very spiritual person, so I believe that the spirit, your intuition, is almost like when you set that intention to inquire, like you said, to investigate, to look deep within yourself for answers that you can't really explain, somehow, if you set that time aside, these answers do come up. I don't know if you've experienced this with other, yourself or with other clients, that somehow the answers come up, and you don't have proof of it. Maybe you don't even have your parents alive anymore to answer these questions, but it feels like this
We're
is
talking about trusting the potency of the soul, because that's really what it is. When we inquire, when we get thinking out of the way, when we don't think, when we really go into the body and experience the way, the ultimate, the way, whatever we want to call it, lives inside of us. When we get out of our own way. I remember there's this great quote by Eckhart Tolle. He said that great thinkers, it's not that they know how to think, it's they know how not to think. And I've always loved that because it's
I
true.
love that.
When we
Yeah.
get out of our own way and we just go inside and we either reflect, meditate, practice some form of mindfulness, then it's as though that information was always there in the first place.
Yeah, and it's just trusting that like what comes out, right? And
Right.
knowing like this is your intuition, this is what's leading you, And I think that when we set out to start on a healing path or a healing journey, you mentioned the breadcrumbs. We're gonna find these breadcrumbs throughout, because this is we've set that intention to heal. And I think that is the most powerful intention you can set to start having these insights, right?
Yeah, I'm
Yeah.
with you, 100%.
Yeah. And what about those if you can give a few tips on those that want to start healing, maybe don't know where to start, how would that look like for them? What do you recommend?
All right. So simply put, to heal, we've got to change our brain. So we have this evolutionary brain that's oriented toward what's negative, and it remembers what's negative, and it focuses on what's negative. And we have this overactive amygdala that they show in trauma can be twice the size of a normal amygdala. We've got to have positive experiences, literally multiple positive experiences that can change our brain. And then we need to practice the new feelings and the new sensations of these positive experiences. When we do this, we not only create new neural pathways, but we also begin to stimulate the release of feel good neurotransmitters like serotonin and dopamine and GABA and feel good hormones like estrogen and oxytocin, even the very genes involved in our body's stress response, the ones we talked about earlier that become chosen to enable us to have a better outcome. Our genes can begin to respond, can begin to function in a different way, an improved way. We can change the way our DNA expresses. Now, how do we do that? So the positive experiences I'm talking about can be practices of receiving comfort or support, like I teach in the book, or feelings of compassion for our parents, which I also teach in the book, or for ourselves, or feelings of gratitude, because these create states like this, experiences like this, feed the prefrontal cortex and help us reframe the stress response. So it has a chance to calm down. It has a chance to downregulate. Gratitude, generosity, loving kindness practice, doing something kind for somebody every day, practicing mindfulness, ultimately anything that allows us to feel peace or strength or joy inside, anything that engages our sense of wonder, curiosity, or awe. The idea, Rosa, is to pull traction away from the limbic system, our overactive amygdala, and bring engagement to the forebrain, specifically our prefrontal cortex, where we can integrate these new experiences and our brains have a chance to change. We know from mindfulness studies, and I talk about these in the book, that practicing mindfulness actually shrinks the amygdala and thickens the prefrontal cortex. I'd say, to put it in a nutshell, we need to practice being with the uncomfortable sensations at first in our body, because that's what we find when we start to meditate. We start to find, there's these feelings of terror, or these feelings of tightness, or these feelings of a tight neck. We need to practice being with the uncomfortable sensations in our body until we reach what's beneath them. And I want to emphasize that. Beneath what's uncomfortable are sensations that we can experience as being life-giving. Sensations like pulsing, tingling, softening, expanding, blood flowing, waves of energy, waves of warmth. When I go in, I feel like a figure eight spiral that goes in my body. And, and then we need to be able to hold these sensations for at least a minute and do that at least 6 times a day. So really what we're talking about minimally is doing something that feels that we can stay within our body that feels positive and do that 6 times a day. That can be enough to change our brain. That can be enough to calm our stress response, down-regulate our amygdala.
Wow, thank you. Thank you for that. I think it sounds simple, right, to do this 6 times a day and this for a minute. Um, and yet it's so hard, right? And I think that's where the healing comes through, right? To be able to sit with the discomfort of these feelings that come up, because that is, I think, in essence, that is the gist of it, right? When it comes to healing trauma, we really do have to be able to sit with this discomfort that triggers us, that triggers our trauma, and that's the hardest part. So if you're able to get
Well, let me give
through
an
that,
example. Let
yeah,
me give it. Let
yeah,
me.
please.
A lot of us have a broken relationship with our mom. I did. And a lot of people, they can't have contact with their mom because they're afraid they'll get hurt again, or she's not very kind. Sometimes and it could stem from being in an incubator when we're small, or she was struggling with dad when we were an infant or even in utero, and we stopped trusting her love. Sometimes I have people put a photograph of their mom, let's say, over their left shoulder above their pillow at night, and look at that photo right before they go to bed, because that's one of the most important times for neuroplastic change. And look at that photograph and say, hey, mom, in real life, we don't do very well, but I'm going to talk to your higher self here. I'm going to visualize this guided by some sort of higher force. And mom, could you hold me in my sleep? Hold me while I'm sleeping and help me heal this bond that broke between us, and help me trust your love because I don't trust it, or teach me how to feel safe, or how to receive your love, or how to let it in so I can feel safe in my body. And in a simple practice like that, looking at the photo of your mom and then closing your eyes and visualize this didn't happen in real life, but it's happening right now. Because Rosa, the brain doesn't know where healing comes from. It doesn't care. It just wants the healing. And visualization, as you know from my book, is just as potent as having something happen in real life. The same regions of the brain, the same neurons activate.
That is so beautiful. I mean, it just visualizing doing that exercise, I could imagine how healing it would be, right? To connect not to your mama in the physical sense, because like you said, a lot of folks don't feel safe physically being around certain people, but talking almost to their soul, right? You're speaking to their soul, and like you said, your brain doesn't know the difference. So connecting to that, it could be just so powerful. And I'm curious if any of your clients have reported that they do that, and somehow
Absolutely.
their mom comes somehow calls, or somehow,
Yeah.
just something happens that connects them in real life.
Yes, because the veil is thin. We're all connected, and but I've been giving this practice for about 30 years to clients, and the reason I keep giving it is it heals. It heals. Soon,
Absolutely.
after a week or two, they start to feel softer. They may call their mom in real life. All of a sudden they find their mom is softer. Sometimes I give people the words. Let's say you have a really broken relationship with your mom. Just these words to your mom in real life can be amazing. Mom, I like that we're close. And your mother's thinking, what? She thinks or he thinks we're close? Oh, we're close. Oh, and then that opens a door for mom to feel close and you to feel close. And it's crazy. But words are, as you know through my book, I talk about them constantly, have so much potency.
Absolutely.
And I could go on and on, right, Rose?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, and thank you again for sharing
Yeah.
so much information and wisdom. We can talk about this forever. I mean, this is such a
Yeah.
fascinating topic. But for the folks that would like to get to know more about you and the work that you do, how can they find you? How can they find your work?
Yeah. Well, if they want to take a training with me, they can go on markwolynn.com. And I just completed a really good training for people who are coaches or clinicians or therapists. or even just want to go and learn how to inquire and go more deeply inside themselves, that's there. But also on my Facebook page, I list all the studies that have come out recently that we can learn about for attachment and generational traumas and how our DNA is affected. So that's on my Facebook page. And that's it.
Yeah,
Go to
no,
those two places. Yeah.
yeah, absolutely. So you have a lot of information out there, and if they
Yeah.
want to work with you,
Website, people everywhere.
yeah, you have more than, and of course your book, right?
And of course, the book. Yeah,
Yeah,
no, I love the book. It's still a bestseller
absolutely.
after all these years. It's still it's actually sold more copies last week than it has ever since it's come out.
That's amazing.
It's
Wow.
one of those books that people tell other people and they tell other people. So I'm very proud of the book.
Yeah.
But yeah, if you want to work with one of us, someone I've trained, or me, if I have a little bit of a waiting list, but come to the website. Yeah.
Oh, thank you so much,
Oh,
Mark, and
you're so welcome,
thank you
Rosa.
for sharing with me today, and for taking the time to be here with us. I appreciate it.
My absolute pleasure, Rosa.
Thank you. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I hope that you found it healing and nourishing to your mind and soul. If there's a friend that you think would benefit from listening to this information, please share it. Share about our podcast. If you feel called to, please leave us a review, as this really, really helps boost our presence here in Apple Podcasts, and it makes it easier for others to find us. To stay up to date on new episode releases and special events and projects that I'm working on, you can follow us on Instagram at Inner Healing Paths Podcast. And you can subscribe to my newsletter by going to my website, which is rosashettylcsw.com. And I will include this information and links in the show notes. Once again, thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to sharing with you again next time.